We're going to talk about the enterprise data model, and it's a slightly different take on it because I'm trying to get through the idea of how we should be using our data model. So we're going to start off with what is it, and then we're going to talk about using it, and then we're going to have a bit of intermission, and then we're going to talk about how you build one. So what is it? So often people tell me sentences, you see, and I listen to them, and then I go, that's weird. So I've never done an enterprise data model outside a project. So I listen to this and I go, how could a project do an enterprise data model? Like, what does that? It's not possible to do an enterprise data model inside a project. So I thought I'd step back a bit from this and go, well, this is a town plan. So there's capital, and there's a market space, and there's a civic centre, and there's some residential stuff happening over here, and there's a lake, and there's various axes drawn. That looks like a town plan. Everyone recognise one of those? Mm-hmm. And it makes sense because if you want to approve a building in a residential area, the town planner goes, no worries. If you want to put a 10-pin bowling alley in a residential area, they go, no, you need to move it to the civic area or another area, right? So it's used to organise and shape towns. And this is a building. We might call this is a project, right? Anyone mix that up with a town plan? Not really. They're very different things. So what buildings do, or projects do, is they construct pieces of the town plan. Now the town plan doesn't know everything on day one. It doesn't know the shape exactly of houses, and it doesn't know the shape of government buildings or whatever, but it knows that's where the government buildings are going to go. You can get lots of people work their entire lives in projects. There's lots of different skills in projects, highly skilled people, engineers, right through to bricklayers, concrete mixers, etc. Highly skilled jobs, but they're not doing town planning. And so if I'm comparing town planning with a building project, and I can say civil engineering and urban development understands this difference between town planning and lot development. And accounting understands the difference between budgeting and expenditure. And IT understands the difference between application planning and application maintenance. And business understands the difference between strategic planning and operational planning. So, and when you start to read DMBOK more carefully, you start to see data architecture is about planning and data modelling is about design. So even DMBOK has started to split it. And so data architecture in DMBOK is about enterprise planning, which is town planning. And so what does enterprise data models answer? What, where and why? What are you going to put, where are you going to put it, and why are you going to put it there? Town planning needs rationale, right? We've decided to put all the residential areas here because the hill's a little bit higher and people will like the view. We decided to put the commercial area here because, you know, it's a bit lower and it's like this. So we decided to put the lake here because it's the lowest point in the land, right? There's a rationale on why. Project data models answer how, when and who. So who is going to be able to update the data? When do they update the data? How's the data updated and maintained? Very different purposes. And if I was going to take an enterprise architecture view, which I'd take a very simple one, business information applications technology, people seen that picture before, then we can say, righto, what is an enterprise data model? And it's formed around a glossary. And what's a glossary? It's a set of agreed nouns. This is the language our enterprise is going to use. Right? So when we say the word student, this is what we mean. When we say the word staff, this is what we mean. When we say the word employee, this is what we mean. So it's centred around a set of agreed words. The closer to the core of your organisation, the more difficult the words are to agree. So when you get into train systems, as soon as you use the word train, everybody has a different view. The maintenance guys think it's something that they actually climb under and fix. The station master thinks it's the 819 train service. The driver thinks that he's going to drive the train from somewhere to somewhere else, right? Everyone thinks of the core concept as different. And so let's centre that round a glossary, and then there are two directions off that glossary. One is that we need to give it structure and generalisation. And that's classically what people think of as an enterprise data model. So we start to say, these things are related to these things and this is how. But it's done at a town planning level, it's not done at a package level. And also generalisation. So generalisation is important because it's going to drive your organisation flexibility and responsiveness. If a town plan specified the actual house design for every single house in the town, then people would constantly be complaining and going, oh, well, I don't want to build it like that. I want to build my own house and structure and things like that. So you need to leave space for people to work. And one of the key ways that you can do that is generalisation. The other thing is that generalisation gives you reuse, because similar objects become the same object when you look at them. And if you can start to generalise and abstract things to become the same, then you have a chance at building less independent systems and data stores, etc. So that's the first person. So generalisation, a large retailer might sell 10,000 different items, right? But they will engineer a supply chain, maybe 10 supply chains, maybe less. So there'll be a frozen goods supply chain, there'll be fast moving consumer goods supply chain. They're not going to have 10,000 separate supply chains for those. So generalisation is very important in an enterprise data model. And the other direction is location and movement. You've got to say where stuff is going to be and how it moves around. So we are going to store all of this sort of data in this place. We're going to store all of this sort of data in this space. This data will not be in this space. It's also important to say what won't happen. So I was in a client recently, they have a CRM, they copy all of their participant data to, or not the participant data, but their people data to a ERP, because they build them every now and again. So they sort of think that they should maintain it. But the CRM has protected data in it. It has addresses of women's shelters and things like that in it. So I said we should not copy that to the ERP. And the IT people go, well, that's hard, Lloyd, because we have to not copy it. But I said the trouble is that means the entire back office has to have a higher level security level, have trained in that. If I can exclude the data from that data store, then the better. So it's not just about moving data around, it's also sometimes choosing not to move data around. And so location and movement. And then there's a whole stack of names that we give deliverables which are designed to sit in that two-dimensional matrix. People call them business glossaries, data set registers, enterprise data models, data catalogues, data information architectures, and data landscapes. Data landscapes are particularly trendy at the moment because they focus on location and movement more than structure and generalisation. And so some or all of those deliverables is what you can use to construct your enterprise data model. And see, then I go, why do I need one? And not every organisation has an enterprise data model or uses it for any particular purpose. So why would I have it? When I finished my Bachelor of Science in 1983, that was my first graduate degree. If I ring up the uni and say, I want my degree and transcript, academic transcript, they will produce it for me. Do I think it's the same system as was running in 1983? Probably not. Did they budget for me to do that in 1983? No. will the same people be there? They'll go, oh, we remember Lloyd. Yes, I'll just go find it, right? Data is a very long-lived resource. So we will actively use data 20, 50 years in many places. This is a bit of a theoretical picture, but I'm trying to make a point. So applications between 5 and 20 years, and then we will change the application. Strategies, so someone says, oh, we need to write an information strategy off the business strategy. Business strategies will only last 5 years at the most. They'll often change within that. So people, I can change over teams or people 3 to 5 year timeframes would be often, if I'm in the same job for 5 years, people feel like that's a long time. So there's a lot of shifting of people. And money, maybe a year. People would argue, oh, if I do an investment, then I've got to pay back the capital over time. But it's a relatively fluid and flexible. I can increase budget, I can decrease budget relatively quickly. So we have here a resource that lives 2 to 3 times longer than anything else, which people will demand access to. And so when I'm doing an enterprise data model, I am interested in a resource which is very slow changing. And if I have that, so I often call it once in a generation things will change. The system will be changed over, the data structures will change. And when I say generation, I mean every 20 to 25 years. And so they are times when you need to be prepared and been able to use an enterprise data model to modify. So these next 4 are outcomes of the data model. So we understand it's a long-lived resource. What outcomes should we get from the data model? So the first one, this is a study, I think it's sponsored by EY, it's done by a uni. But this is not a unique paper that's been written at all. Right? Basically, lots of organisations have in their strategy data. Oh, we need to love data, and we've suddenly fallen in love with it. The vast majority continue to keep their data in silos and strangle their efforts at birth. It's a nice quote, that. Not sure it's at birth. I think sometimes it lives a year and then it dies. So the first thing about an enterprise data model is that it should break down silos. That's its purpose. Second area, there is a lot of people wanting us to store more data, but there is also a fairly large philosophical group out there that are saying we actually got enough data, we just don't manage it or use it. No, we don't store it in a way that we can exploit it. So we spend hours trying to exploit it. It's too difficult. So the second way that an enterprise data model should help us is to increase our ability to manage and exploit data. The third outcome. Have people heard of a big ball of mud? It was written in a paper in 1999 about software. And it is a system with no discernible structure. It's a software design anti-pattern. So it is used as a software design, but it's an anti-pattern because it's chaotic. It's common, especially with the advent of packages, where people think they don't have to design anymore, they just do. And a big ball of mud's haphazardly structured, sprawling, sloppy, duct tape, embedding wire, spaghetti code jungle. The systems show unmistakable times of unregulated growth and repeated expedient repair. The information is shared promiscuously, I'll get that right, to where all information just becomes duplicated and copied around. Only those, this is my favourite part of the quote, this is on Wikipedia, only those who are unconcerned about architecture and perhaps are comfortable with the inertia of day-to-day chore of patching holes in these failing dikes are content to work on such systems. The concept was originally applied to software, but it's equally applicable to data management in many organisations. The organisation has become used to quick, expedient repair, sticking fingers in dikes, trying to keep the thing together. And that's actually become the natural way of operating. We call that the company culture. And so the third outcome of an enterprise data model is to stop the crisis. You need to stop the crisis mode. And the last one is an observation that I've made because it's 100% true in places that I work, which is when faced with a data problem, 100% of organisations change their technology. Right. So they go, oh, Teradata is too expensive, we'll get Hadoop. Oh, Hadoop's expensive, we'll get Oracle back. Oh, Oracle's too expensive, we'll get Teradata. Like I almost see these circuits when you go between organisations. And you go, so have you got less duplicate data this year than last year? I don't know, we're too busy moving it between database systems. And especially the hype around database systems like Hadoop, and I use that quite deliberately, they just store data, has enabled us to actually miss the point that we're just moving things between data stores. And so the fourth, and why are people changing between technology? Sometimes because they have a data problem, like I am duplicating my data hundreds of times over, so I need a faster platform. That's typically why people go to Hadoop. They get off a structured database and go to Hadoop because they're duplicating their data, and so they need a place to duplicate it without any concern. Right? The cost structure in Hadoop to store 100 times as much data is much lower than other databases. So let's just implement Hadoop instead of trying to figure out the problem of storing our data 100 times. So many people are searching for miracle cures. Has ever been so. Right? Snake oil salesman, anti-aging cream. I've got a database for you. And so my 4 outcomes of an enterprise data model are to break down silos. I should be creating enterprise conversation, not silo-based conversation. It's to allow data exploitation. So my enterprise data model should allow data to be more easily exploited. I should stop the crisis mode. So my objective is to plan and execute. And in this conference, when I've listened, a lot of people assume that war is won. I don't believe that war's won. I think a lot of people love the crisis. But you think about other disciplines, I don't think that this building was built in a state of perpetual crisis. Right? Someone designed it, architected it, designed it, engineered it, built it. Right? I'm sure it has rough edges to it, but the overall concept wasn't done as a crisis. I don't think Canberra as a town plan was built as a crisis, in a crisis mode. So stopping the crisis mode and then stopping magical thinking. I have given presentations to some organisations where the vendor has immediately said, well, Lloyd's got it wrong, you just need to buy a piece of tech and then it will be all right. Right. Which is really interesting because you go, I'm pretty sure 10 years ago you were selling this stuff. And so 4 outcomes. Now, I have expressed that as a set of outcomes that are not based on is the data model right or not? Is the glossary right or not? Is there some technical correctness to this thing? I've expressed it in terms of if I've got a working enterprise data model, then it should be giving me these sort of outcomes. So I free myself up from the need to have a fabulous data model at the centre of this. Using it. Critical success factor is that it's used. So I don't care about the methodology or whether the address is modelled as a location or a separate concept. Actually, I do when I'm doing the job, but like I've modelled them both ways in the last 12 months. Many people are making a statement, data's at the heart of everything we do. So what does that mean, and how can an enterprise data model help us? So I've nicked this model off Chris Bradley. People may have seen it. It's still an image, I just like it. And so he's basically saying the languages and rules of the data model, which I've procured as the enterprise data model, define business architectures. So if I use the word a radical approach to enhance customer experience, I better know what a customer is. Does that include prospects? Does that include customers that are actively doing service with them right now? Does that ones that we dropped off 6 months ago? If I'm going to improve experience, I better know what that noun means. Or in information services, which everyone sort of gets in data models. In business processes, so a business process is just a verb acting on a noun, right? So if my nouns aren't defined, my processes effectively don't help me at all. And then procedures and presentation services, and which we'll see a little bit later. So I reckon an enterprise data model can work in 3 of these 4. Scoping initiatives, which is really what a town plan does, right? It sort of says, here's the edge of the lot, etc. Some requirements, and then user experience. So let's use this. Start with scoping, specifically scoping initiatives. So if any time it's going to be useful, it should be useful for this. So there's some key purposes that I'm going to start with an initiative. I want to gain reuse. If every initiative starts and goes, the first thing we have to do is build completely new infrastructure, then we're going to end up with this splintered infrastructure over time. And so one of the things I should be using the enterprise data model is to help me with reuse. The second one is completeness, and the third one is adoption. If I'm using common languages, hopefully other people will reuse my infrastructure that I deploy. So I have some statements of an initiative, like strategy to reduce the current market risks for consumers by streamlining customer renewal processes, the stages that a permit can progress through initialisation, the compliance process will drop to 1 per annum. So I've got a bunch of statements in my initiative. And I've got this enterprise subject model. I wanted to make it less than 9 boxes, but then I thought people would look at it and go, well, that's stupid, Lloyd, that's too small. So this is my enterprise data model, and it defines my key 9 nouns: stakeholder, risk, law, responsibility, service, regulatory, product, location, financial, department. Maybe it's not a very good data model. It's the best I could do. So what I did was I then went through someone's sentences and fixed all the nouns. All right. So customer is an undefined word, not going to have it. Change it to stakeholder. Processes are undefined, it's the word service. Stakeholder responsibility renewal rather than a management permit. So permits are not defined, responsibility is. Reduced number of responsibility renewals allowing risk as service. Compliance processes drop to 1 with the number of responsibilities, so they use the word license there instead of permit, and the customer has. Right, so I can start correcting English in strategies, policies, procedures, any business document. I can start to reduce the vocabulary. So number 1 is I can increase my reuse by aligning to an enterprise glossary, generalising scope and avoiding ambiguity. I have been in many places where after about $50,000 or $100,000 is spent on requirements, they go, I don't think that's in scope. And you go, seriously? How does a project get into the middle of it and not understand its scope? Completeness. So I have built a number of tools. They're not very difficult to build, where you ask 2 or 3 questions on each subject. If you run a subject model like this, 30 questions, right? Does it affect this subject area? Are there any new ones? Do those people currently exist? Or do those things currently exist in our data? So in other words, is it data that we know, or is it brand new data? And you can mark it as a high impact on those subjects, and as a medium impact on those subjects, and low impact on those subjects. And then you can take the enterprise data model and go and look at the applications and the technology that support it. So you can get a much clearer picture earlier on of the scope of your initiative. You can be clear that you haven't forgotten anything, and then you can also go and do impact analysis in applications, technology and business processes. And so using the baseline enables an assessment of impacted applications, business process and technology. So much more completeness. Projects go over budget, often not because they discovered new scope, but because they never even thought about it in the first place at this point. They just start off with some little piece of it, and then they go, oh, we forgot about that application. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. We forgot about this particular process. Oh, yeah. We forgot about this. And so you might not be happy to have a bigger scope at the beginning, because it's one of the ways that organisations get bigger projects than they should through. But assuming that you're interested in understanding a more complete scope, and then you can actually, if you cut scope, you can cut it much more clearly up front. So you can say, you know what, that data is not going to get updated in the future because we're not going to connect that application. Adoption. What's interesting in clients and customers, permits in scope or just licenses? That is a serious question that I had in a project about, as I said, we just spent $100,000 on license renewals, and we'd already written all the requirements for permit renewals. And so you go, how did we do that? And then the trouble was we had permit and license renewal requirements which we had to merge back together. So we didn't create a customer experience where we were demanding different data and different processes from the same person. So, is my license in scope since it's in the same system as permits? And so by clearly articulating scope, using common and hopefully increasingly well understood concepts, so by just starting to use the same concept again and again and again, then you get benefit from familiarity. Requirements. 2009 was the last time I witnessed someone writing requirements down which were implemented in full for a fixed price. So it's a decade of my life. I happen to be the one that wrote the requirements. They don't ask me much more to write requirements. So, got too old or something. So, ever since then, every single project I've watched, they write requirements and then they trash them. The developers go, no, we're not interested in that. And I've seen agile requirements, long form requirements, short form requirements, all ignored. So it's been going on for about a decade. And one of the issues with requirements is the lack of management of nouns. So these requirement documents will be long or short, but they won't manage the nouns, and so the requirements are actually useless, because as soon as a IT developer or a business process procedure tries to write things, they go, what's a client? Undefined. What's a license? Undefined. So let's say I wrote some requirements around a concept, stakeholder. There are how many lines? 7 lines, because I have 7 processes around this data concept. Right? So let's say instead that I haven't managed my nouns, and so I have 3 nouns for the same concept: customer, partner and client. Right? Don't think this is such, sometimes there's more than 3. It's one of those things that you dial back reality. So guess what happens next? Now I have to put all these processes around it, but because I've got 3 nouns, I get these inconsistent sets. So now I think I've got 17 lines on there, but that's only my laziness. I've been in places where you can have an order of magnitude more requirements than you need, because each noun has to be tackled independently. And so instead of a requirements with 7 lines in it, I have a requirements with 17 lines in it. Because my requirements are 3 times as big, the chances of me simplifying the design during the IT design are significantly reduced, and just getting my mind around all of these different requirements. So I haven't controlled the nouns, the processes have duplicated, the documentation has increased, and I'm already well on the way to going over budget and under-delivering. So every noun that you create becomes an entity. Every entity you create becomes a database. Every database that you create becomes data, and some poor bastard in the business has to manage that, like when there's exceptions or errors or whatever. And so you have operations, security, all of those things, processes, end up happening around every data concept. So the more data concepts, if you can't reduce the data concepts at the front, then you will end up with a bigger cost structure, a poorer experience at the back. User experience. I am a little old-fashioned, it's not the latest idea, but I break user experience into 3 levels. Presentation, like what's coming at me, icons, pictures, sound, whatever. Dialogue, which is how does it flow? So I start something, particularly processes or transactions, have flows to them, but how do I click around a website? And then conceptual model. So what am I thinking as I'm doing it? So I took apart some major Australian corporations' website, and we'll have a look at the presentation layer. And see, I think of icons as something that should have consistent meaning to them. That sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Like if they had a red hexagonal sign, and sometimes it meant stop and sometimes it means give way, like you can decide, that sort of wouldn't work, would it? So on their website, they have something that looks like a phone. I don't know what the 3 buttons are for. That sometimes are mobile phones, and sometimes it's about mobility, and sometimes it's about, well, SIM, but that's sort of a phone, but it's not. And then you can also, the phone can set up, manage or troubleshoot, so it's actually a process, but it also includes tablets. And there's another one up the top left, which is mobiles and tablets, which is a picture of a tablet. And there's also a picture of the tablet just with the word tablet. And I wasn't exhaustive. After a while I just went, this is too easy. This is like, what is it, shooting fish in a barrel. So, and then down the bottom is another set of logos. So there's this sort of mobile phone thing with a little USB stick and that. They use that to mean mobile broadband, which is fine. On other parts of the website, they use it to mean the internet, which I don't know whether that's mobile broadband or not, because the internet feels like it's different. But the internet really isn't NBN. Like NBN's one, how to access the internet or something. So I'm not actually sure what that one means, but they put the little thing just to be sure. And it says support for NBN, ADSL, cable plus speed and outage is when they put that symbol there. Then they have broadband and NBN trademark, and then NBN sometimes is by itself. So there's at least 3 different symbols for NBN. So at the presentation level, the management of nouns and concepts, clearly they're not taking their enterprise data model seriously. Because otherwise they would create presentations which are simpler. I skipped dialogue and I had a look at conceptual models. And so they have 3 different ways of making this work. So the top one, it has mobile phones, prepaid mobiles, tablets, mobile broadband, etc. You can click one of those buttons and it takes you to that particular product page. So you go, okay, so if I click the button, then it takes me to, I'm interested in that as it's a noun-based icon system, right? Which is exactly what our mobile phones are. There isn't a verb on a mobile phone. All our mobile phones, tablets, etc., are all noun-based interactions. The second one is completely different. It's a process-oriented. The icon works as a button, sort of, but now it's for a process. So I can pay my bill or manage my bill or set up direct debit or request a payment or request an email bill on my bill paid. So the same interaction concept, very different meaning and use of the concept. And the third one, you can't press, it's help text. So stay connected, again using the same mobile thing for a completely different purpose. And you can't click it, so when it comes up on the screen exactly the same place as in the other places, but they're not usable. They have benefits of this. So I'm not actually sure what you do with that screen at all. So if the conceptual model was we provide our data concepts as a set of icons which users can manipulate to achieve their outcomes, that concept is got at least 3 different implementations. So what happens is my head hurts when I use the website, which means I ring the call center, except they won't answer either. So you get frustrated. It creates cognitive load on people. And people aren't that interested in the 30 different ways of representing things. They just want to pay their bill or something. So we could imagine that an enterprise data model and UX professionals could work more in partnership, particularly websites and portals. There's a lot of misuse of nouns and structures that are in an enterprise data model, which on websites and portals people feel, I don't need to follow that. So what is data is at the heart of everything we do mean? How can we use that to help us achieve it? And so scoping, requirements and user experience. The first one in scoping is you can use an enterprise data model to increase reuse, completeness and adoption. In requirements, you can maintain and minimize complexity as you go through. So intentionally cut scope back. You're not actually cutting scope back, it's more like you're pruning the plant that's growing and you have to keep it cut back. And the third one is we can use the data model to project much more into a conceptual or presentation of our organization. Even paper forms have data models in them. Right? So any channel can be assisted by an enterprise data model. Right, building it. How do we build an enterprise data model? I have 3 basic approaches. All 3 approaches are used in the market. I'm constantly challenged about which one's the best. I've used all 3 actually in the last 12 months. Here's one I prepared earlier. So a lot of people walk around with their subject model hidden in their back pocket and they arrive at a new place and they go, there's my subject model. Ta-da. From first principles, so you can get all of your current data structures out. Some of the NDIA data model that we did was I wrote from first principles. So I actually got out the data structures and the legislation and built it. And then what do you reckon? Which is when the client turns up with one. Now there's a nightmare. Here's one I prepared earlier. So you have this in your back pocket, stakeholder risk, legal context, agreement, and then you sit down with a client and they go, oh, we can't have agreements, we have responsibilities, we can't have events, we have services, we don't have legal context, we have law, we don't have us, we have the department. And you go, result, morning's work done, got a subject area model. Because remember, I'm trying to get to the point of using it, not building it. So it speeds the work, but may not fit brilliantly. And also sometimes the clients feel like they're being ripped off a bit. Right? Because they go, well, you turned up to do an enterprise data model and you did it in a morning. I feel like that's a bit inadequate. And so sometimes they get excited, but also it's not really theirs. So it's fast, but trying to get adoption may be more difficult. Because they go, we engage in an academic exercise with you, Lloyd, but we're not actually going to call them responsibilities. We're going to call them permits and licenses because that's what the legislation says. We haven't actually bought into the idea of a data model. From first principles, so I sit down with a bunch of primary data, forms, manuals, legislation, whatever, build something from first principles, and then I generalize it. So I take the concept of employment, which was on the form, and I say that's an organisation or a person, and that belongs to stakeholder. Take a loan agreement and say that's an agreement. Apply for a loan as a service, a loan as a product, and part of us is a credit manager. So I start to take real things and generalise them into subjects. And I end up with a subject set at the end. What do you reckon? So this is my newest version. So effectively, a client turned up and he said, we've agreed all the domains. We've gone to the CEO and we've sat down with him and we said, what do you think our data domains are? And here's the list that we came up with. Can you work with this? And I went, who masters customer? Is it in the customer administration, customer delivery, customer counselling? I go, oh, I haven't thought about that. So, like, where's the person's address or whatever? How's this working? So, but on the other hand, they've put all this effort in and it is their work. So as a professional, you can sit there and go, well, it's wrong, but I've won on at least adoption. And so I drew a little sort of thing about how it would achieve outcomes. So I prepared this earlier from first principles, or when the customer goes, what do you reckon? And I sort of said, breaking down silos, I prepared this earlier, is not very good because it's a bit magical and it's sort of, people go, oh, okay. From first principles, it can be slightly better because I can work through with them and I can say, well, we've agreed that we're going to generalise this concept. Right. And then what do you reckon? If their go at a data model actually breaks down the silos, then you sort of achieved it, right? So you just go, yep, we'll take that on then. Right. If you can't see silos in the model, focus on the problem. Here's one I prepared earlier. It's not bad because you walk in and you go, the problem is not your enterprise data model key subjects. It's about implementing it in requirements and user experience and scoping. So here's a fast start. And they go, oh, okay. From first principles, that can give you better engagement. What do you reckon? The trouble is that if it's not organised like a data model, it's often got a bit of a process or org unit sort of feel to these things that people do. Maybe it's going to be more difficult to use. Lose the crisis mode. Here's one I prepared earlier. You can just say, look, I've done the data model now, let's move on. From first principles, what do you reckon? You can start to say, that's great, it's a plan, let's use it. And then you can refine it as you go. Stop magical thinking, gave 2, 2 and 3. And then critical success factor on use. I felt when clients come up with their own models, that is the easiest to get the adoption on. And then the middle one is in from first principles. So that was my little marking exercise on the 3 different alternate approaches and what's going to achieve the outcome. Now, I suspect you could then say, well, what about in this case? And I'd go, well, I've just changed my mind, I'll do this. But I'm attempting to talk about approaches in a coherent way. It's more it puts more the load on the consultant or the contractor or the architect or the person becomes higher as you move to the right. So I prepared this earlier. It's like, frankly, I've got it here already. Right? Zero effort on my part. I don't have to learn any of this. You have to learn everything because you have to learn what I'm thinking. First principles, at least I'm working with the data of the organisation, and so that should make it's more work for me. And then the last one is the most work for me because effectively I might view that there's been no real enterprise data modelling being done to date. I'm just going to use your first go at it and I'm going to spend my whole time trying to fix it. Right? But I'm going to do it in a way that it's not I'm not denying what you did. I'm just like, let's talk about where person will be mastered then. Let's talk about where address will be mastered. And so you're doing the data modeling, but because you're working in someone else's frame, it's the hardest job. The problem is that when you work in someone else's frame, it's the easiest to get adoption.